You enjoy being a rich man's toy, do you?
I enjoy society, flaws and all. You people venerate savagery, and you will die. Savagely. All of you.
Oh, we're all gonna die, Agent.
Some of us sooner than others. Good day, Mr. Morgan.
Goodbye.
Enjoy your fishing, kid, while you still can.
If you've ever played Red Dead Redemption 2, you likely recognize the importance of these words. They're spoken by one Agent Milton, a man committed to ending the very way of life our protagonist, Arthur Morgan, is fighting for. It's a relatively short scene, a minute at most, but it's spoken in such a haunting manner that the player is sure to remember them. Red Dead Redemption follows Arthur as he fights for his own way of life, one separate from society, one different from the civilized way of life. One Arthur believes in. He fights tooth and nail for it, giving everything he has, and in the end he's left with nothing. Anything or anyone he ever loved was ripped away, taken by this new way of life. As the story unfolds, Arthur watches as members of his group, the Vanderlyn gang, die, put down like wild animals, and as the story nears its end, Arthur shares the same fate. Although it's up to the player whether Arthur dies a peaceful death or a savage one, the result is all the same. If we look at Red Dead in its most stripped down form, it's like any other game, with a beginning, end, and gameplay mixed throughout. Side missions, main missions, it's all there, but between that, somewhere in the middle of the line, there's something else. Not gameplay or story, not characters or towns, but something indescribable. While riding around Red Dead's vast open world, I found myself not really exploring it, but rather getting lost. Not even 10 hours into my playthrough, I made my way up to the northern part of the map. I didn't have to, there was no mission indicator up here, I just wanted to. And as I made my way up, I became increasingly isolated. Alone. I spent multiple nights here, hunting, camping, and just riding around, complacent in this lonely but beautiful lifestyle. I began to realize that this is the lifestyle Arthur was fighting for. Not to be an infamous outlaw, just isolated. Isolated from a rapidly industrializing world. But Red Dead Redemption 2's focus on story is not a unique concept.
Well, they come as if from outer space in a variety of weird guises. Defender, Pac-Man, asteroids. To fans, they represent a challenge, but to critics, as Terry Drinkwater reports, they are a menace.
Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, 1981's Donkey Kong is credited as the first story told through gaming. It introduces the player to Jumpman, our protagonist, and his former pet-turned-nemesis Donkey Kong. Throughout the game, Jumpman must avoid barrels, fire, and other obstacles in order to rescue his beloved Princess Pauline. Of course, we now know this as the story of Mario, a narrative that today doesn't seem all that complex, but at the time, a story within a video game was unheard of. Games are developed with two factors in mind, fun and replayability. So naturally, games developed prior to Donkey Kong focused on gameplay. A decade prior, Atari would start its decade-long dominance on the arcade industry with the release of Pong, and just 6 years after that, one of arcade gaming's most influential games would be published by Midway, Space Invaders. Both Midway and Atari took gaming by storm, looking like unstoppable juggernauts. Pong, Space Invaders, these games lack any cohesive narrative, yet they still made millions. About halfway through Red Dead Redemption 2's story, you can find a side quest in Rhodes offered by a man named Jeremiah Compton. He doesn't really stand out, just a drunk whining on a bench, but he feels familiar. He talks loaded with self-hate, reminiscent of his past, and bitter. In a lot of ways, he reminds Arthur of himself, a man he could have become if corrupted by his own hate and violence. So you agree to retrieve a few of his items, collections of his past that might give him just some relief. The quest takes you to his house, long abandoned and claimed by the bank. It's mostly just rubble and forgotten items from a life long before, but as you explore the house, you discover clues of the life Jeremiah Compton led before. You find a family portrait taken and gifted by his former employer, and on the back, a thank you for his work on a farm. In the next room, you find a letter of termination from one Colonel Nixon, the owner and employer of the old man's place. It appears Mr. Compton, the old man, worked at a farm called the Ascension Plantation. As the player, you start to question the legitimacy of Mr. Compton's life and his life's work. Something he describes so favorably is so disfavorably associated with history. But still, As you learn of Mr. Compton's late wife, you remain cautiously optimistic that he's not what he appears. You learn of his children and their disdain for his actions. You discover a different employer, the Central Union Railroad Company, who also decided his ideologies were no longer welcome. You find a diary belonging to a man on the run that, for some sick reason, Mr. Compton decided to keep, and finally you find his ledger, detailing his requisitions of runaway slaves. As you return to Mr. Compton, living out of a tent, you're given a choice. Kill Mr. Compton for his choices or let him live in misery. Mr. Compton is a relic in this world. His ideas and career are considered an afterthought, no longer legitimate. His way of life is gone, his choices and way of thinking denounced for more progressive standards. Ultimately, his fate remains the choice of the player, but regardless, Mr. Compton and his way of life are forgotten. In 2018, Detroit Become Human proposed an interesting question. Set in a distant but believable dystopian future, AI has become a part of everyday life. However, what if that AI were to become sentient? What if these machines built to help humans wanted to become them? One of the game's main characters is a detective named Hank Anderson. In both his early academics and career, Hank excelled, looking like a young prodigy. As he climbed the ranks of his police force, he decided to have a son, Colin, but tragically, just 6 years into his life, Colin would suffer fatal injuries in a car accident. Had there been a human doctor around to operate on Hank's son, he may or may not have survived. But with human doctors unavailable, an android was forced to operate, evidently unsuccessful in his attempts. This is where Hank's hatred for androids began, with the death of his son Colin. Though he still had a promising career, the work of artificial intelligence didn't seem too far behind. With androids later implemented into his very own police force, medical services, and even people's homes, they became unavoidable. Detroit Become Human is a player choice game, so the fate of its characters are ultimately in the hands of the player, but the 3 years separating Colin's death and the events of the main game were bad for Hank. In a rapidly industrializing world, one Hank didn't want, he falls into deep stages of depression and alcoholism. He can't accept his son's death, especially at the hands of an android, and the world around Hank is a constant reminder of his failure. Once a promising prodigy, Hank Anderson's way of life is no more, just forgotten, and any chance he had in an ordinary life was ripped away, destroyed by one mistake.
I'd like an Atari 2600 system, please, and everything that goes with it.
Everything? You sure want everything?
I want everything.
Now you get a new low price, up to $30 of rebate offers, and a free pack.
Is that everything?
It's not everything. You can get nearly 300 different cartridges.
300?
That's nothing.
It's something.
But it's not everything. Soon there'll be a voice module, trackball, remote control joysticks, and a computer keyboard.
It's amazing.
It's amazing, but it's not everything.
It's not everything.
Soon there'll be educational games, too.
Is that everything?
That's everything. For now.
For now?
In 1983, a great crash occurred in the video game industry, dropping the industry's revenue from $3.2 billion to under $100 million, a fall of nearly 97%. There were many factors contributing to the crash, but a big one was overpriced and underdeveloped games, mainly ones produced by Atari. The massive influx of low-quality games oversaturated the video game market, and for a few years, the longevity of video games were questioned. The era of Atari's dominance was over, and video games as a whole were near extinct. But in 1992, Atari would close its doors, marking the end of one of gaming's founding fathers, while Nintendo was on top of the world. Atari had fallen out of favor, unable to adapt. Unwelcome and unwanted, their legacy has remained the same for 30 years, while Nintendo is still building theirs. But their old partner, Midway, they were thriving. NBA Jam, Mortal Kombat, things couldn't be better. While Nintendo ruled home consoles, Midway dominated the arcades. A healthy balance. But Midway started to get a little greedy, a little too ambitious. They wanted to break into territory that was off limits. The home consoles. Although Midway would find some success in home consoles, Nintendo's influence spawned a new generation of gaming, ending the arcade era. And with Midway having no real stake in home consoles and pretty much every asset in arcade gaming, it spelled disaster. Ironically, this new age of gaming led Midway to buy Atari, a move that only foreshadowed the company's downfall. And although Midway would help publish classics like Doom and Quake, behind each of those successes were 3 failures. And soon, Midway met the same fate as Atari. Midway fell 10 steps behind Nintendo and they never caught up. The age of Midway was over, kind of forgotten, while Nintendo established itself as one of gaming's most legendary companies. As the Vanderlyn gang falls apart, Arthur remains loyal. Not wanting to abandon his way of life, he fights, but the age of outlaws and gunslingers is coming to an end. Red Dead Redemption 2's brilliance is a misconception. Its genius isn't its story or the characters, it's not the gameplay or the gunplay, it's the finer details. Rockstar made that choice of gameplay or story, but they didn't just choose one. They'd already done the blockbuster action game with a great story and even better gameplay. In fact, they still milk it to this day. What they hadn't done was create an open world that challenges the very concept open worlds are built upon. Of course, there are sprawling towns and interesting encounters while traversing Red Dead, and to their credit, they held my interest until the moment they were over. But the part I remember the most about Red Dead is the time spent between these towns and these countries. Red Dead's open world is lonely and harsh, beautiful and vast. If it's your first playthrough, these moments where you're completely alone, camping in some long abandoned snowy town, these moments feel special. If it's a later playthrough, you cherish these moments, not wanting to advance the story. You understand Arthur's way of life and why he fights for it, even if it inevitably ends. You do everything to avoid main missions, but still, eventually, time catches up, and so does Arthur's loyalty. You people venerate savagery, and you will die savagely. Arthur, Mr. Compton, Hank, their way of life was replaced, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't get it back. Atari, Midway, their lack of adaptation ultimately killed them, replaced by giants like Nintendo who understood how to survive. These stories happen all the time. People stuck in their ways, unwilling or unable to change. And with the rise of AI, another age of adaptation is coming. We've already seen corporations replace artists with AI, and there's no telling how far it'll go. But like Arthur, I'd like to enjoy my way of life a little longer, loyal to the things I enjoy. One day, I might be replaced by a ChatGPT script and voiced by an android, but for now, I'm enjoying the finer details. The morning drives to the gym, the late night talks with friends. It's a way of life that will inevitably end, especially with college around the corner, but I'll be sure to remember it. I've not played every great video game there is, just the ones I've been lucky enough to find. What makes Red Dead 2 so special are those finer details, those isolating moments that others call boring. Camping in the blistering cold with snow pelting my tent, riding the desolate countryside on a quiet night. 30 years from now, regardless of my situation or circumstance, those moments won't be forgotten. Every pathway hammered by a horse's hooves, every bush left with nothing but the wind. The world is invigorating. This forgotten way of life, of living off the land and enjoying what's given, I'll remember it, and hopefully you will too.
Shut up. No, stop! No! Stop it! Stop it! Stop! I can't hear the bomb guy!
It's on it! It's on it!
Stop!